Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roberts from TPXimpact. I guess I've been working on public sector data in one form or another for most of my career. And my talk today is really just to explain why there's this thing on the desk in front of you and roughly what's in it. So one of the things that we've been doing over the last few months is doing some research, talking to people across the public sector to gather thoughts on where we are today in terms of government data, what's different now to where we were perhaps 10 years ago, what are the trends, what are the latest challenges, and to make some contribution to that discussion of what should we do about it. It's certainly not the last word on any of these questions. We know how difficult and complex they are, and one of the reasons that we only had this event and the way that we've set it up and structured it is to try to get views from everyone here and think of this as a kind of a thought provoker or a conversation starter, and something that will help us kind of learn where do we go with this kind of thing over the coming years. I'm I guess a techie by background. I did maths and physics at university and did all kinds of stuff with software engineering. But as time has gone on, I've come to the conclusion that the hardest things about making good use of data are not the technical ones. Those are sometimes are hard, but they're usually solvable. But it's that kind of how does that fit into how people work together, how the organizations work together, and that kind of mix of kind of technical and organizational, if you like, I think is where our big challenges lie. And we've explored some of those things in this report. So the one thing is that I guess I was the lead author on this, but it's very much not all my efforts. And there's some special thanks to these people who I had very interesting conversations with that fed a lot of ideas into what's gone into the report. And there are many other people that we've talked to kind of less formally and people whose work that I've read to gather into the research. So try to kind of take ideas from lots of different places, and thanks to everyone who's contributed to it. The question that we were trying to answer with this is, how do we ensure that data is used for the benefit of everyone? And we're meaning this in the context of how it's used in government, but then how does government support making the country a better place for its citizens through understanding the country better? So we were thinking about where are we now? What's different now to what was happening a few years ago? Everyone in this room has probably worked on different aspects of this, of how we use data for supporting public services or targeting allocation of resources or feeding into policy design or policy implementation. So everyone here knows that it's hard, and we try to explore some of the reasons that make it difficult. And we've tried to make some suggestions for, well, what should we do about it? We've been working on this for a long time. I think there's been some good progress, and I'll talk about some of those things in a few minutes. But a recent paper from government, the State of Digital Government Review, concluded that data is fragmented and underused. I think 70% of the respondents to their survey said that I'm just reading this off my notes, say their data landscape is not well coordinated, interoperable, and does not provide a unified source of truth. But the report does go on to recognize that, despite that, there's been lots of good work with data, and recognize the phrase was ingenuity of civil servants to, despite these difficulties, to do good things. But nonetheless, that we are still in that problem of that there's lots of data out there, but you can't necessarily get it. And another kind of data point on that landscape was Chris Whitty giving evidence to the COVID inquiry a month or so ago, was saying that he thinks that in some ways we're doing worse now than we were during the pandemic. And that was obviously an interesting time in lots of ways, and because of the urgency of the problems that the government was trying to tackle, some barriers that normally get in the way of things were swept aside or ignored. And so because of the urgency of it, a lot of stuff happened very quickly, but also it brought a recognition, I think, to people who didn't already have it, of the importance of good information to design what the government was doing. And there's a question of how can we, if you like, kind of regain that sense of importance and urgency of doing things with data, because Perhaps the problems facing us now are not all as urgent as the first weeks of the pandemic, but I think many of those problems are probably bigger. Dealing with climate change, how do we support an aging population and make for healthy lives for the population? Those are not the only ones, but there's some real kind of fundamental challenges facing us, and data for that is every bit as important as data for the pandemic. So I would like to argue that we're at a pivotal moment, excuse my cheesy pun, on how we work with data. I think the importance of it is well recognized, and the importance of it is set to accelerate, possibly rapidly, with the advent of AI. We can all see that things are changing rapidly around us. But with AI innovations mainly being dominated by big private companies from America, whose interests may not always align with the interests of the citizens of Britain. How do we take advantage of the new things but make sure that it works for everyone? And so how can the government, I guess, take advantage of the opportunities in the best possible way? But don't worry, the government's got a plan. We need to replace that chaos with some coordination. Come on, everyone, what have we been doing? I mean, obviously, this is a good ambition, and I think it kind of summarizes really well, actually, what we've all been doing. But we have been working on this for some time, and the key question is how do we go about doing this? I guess it was about 2013 that I was one of many contributors to the Shakespeare Review of Public Sector Information, which concluded some things not tremendously different to this. In 2019, I had a lot of time. Well, I mean, I liked what was in the national data strategy that came out in about 2019 and was then updated on that. And that's fed into quite a lot of the things that have happened in the last few years in data. So those were, I think, recognizing what needs to be done, but the progress to do it has been quite slow. I think slower than probably most people in this room would have liked it to be. And that's probably because it's difficult. And so we're trying to investigate, well, why is it difficult and what can we do to improve it? I think there's been a lot of good progress. You could recognize things like the work of CDDO on the data marketplace and data maturity assessments. I think are starting to have a real effect. The integrated data service that's been led by ONS to get research data more accessible has produced good stuff. And the government's plans of creating a new digital centre that's going to try and concentrate the efforts around data and digital looks promising to me, but it's very early stages. But we're still left with that situation where if we've got our kind of FAIR principles of findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data, we're still struggling with the findable. There's clearly a lot to do. So good work, but we know we're not there yet. So there were, I think, three main themes that came out of the research that we tried to use as a summary. One that came up a lot was how do we treat data as a strategic asset? So treating something as an asset, you invest in it, you maintain it, you expect some kind of return from it. How do you make that work in terms of the policy challenges that we're trying to do? I think some of the reasons that's hard are balancing incentives. Often the cost of creating the asset goes to one part of government, but the return on that investment may be spread across lots of governments. So how do you make that work? And the value of data, as Tom was saying, is only when it's used. So we should be starting with, well, what are the problems that government's trying to solve and what data do we need for that? Not, I've got some data here, can you find a use? And so I think the government's approach of mission-led government, obviously we'll see how that turns out in practice, but that kind of idea of identifying the big missions which go across the work of lots of departments is probably quite a good thing to hang this on, because departments are going to have to work together to make this happen, and that means that the data that you need for those policy challenges is going to have to come from different places and be available in lots of places. And if you are thinking of data as an asset with a value and trying to justify and target your investment, then how do you quantify the value of the assets? Which things should you prioritize? There's some interesting work from National Highways on how they put financial values on their assets. And one of our discussion topics today is to kind of go into the different kind of economic techniques that you might use to try to work out what a value of an asset is and what's useful. So that's certainly important. Another big one was people's trust in government and trust in the way that government's going to use data, and also how do you make data kind of work for the benefit of everyone. And we commissioned a survey. We got a polling company to ask 2,000 people across the country a series of questions related to trust. We're going to publish the full set of questions and data sometime in the next couple of weeks, so people can have a look at what was asked and exactly what people said. And there's some summaries of it in the report. But I don't think you'd be too surprised that one thing was that people recognize that it's important for government to do things with data, but a lot of them are quite untrusting of what government does with data, because they don't really understand, they don't know what happened, and so they assume the worst, and they assume that government will mess it up. So there's a lot of work to do to get the sort of citizen buy-in to things that government's doing. And we asked lots of questions, but some people said there was nothing government could do that would make them trust them more, but there's always going to be some people like that. But of all the questions all of the options that people had of what would make them trust government more transparency was the main one. I think people want to know what's happening, and if they do know what's happening, then they'll probably make more kind of balanced judgments of whether they agree with it. So we've made some recommendations in the report. In the interest of time, I won't go too far into them, but working in the open and engaging widely, these are reasonably obvious to everyone possibly, but I think these kind of basic things are really important and will make a contribution. And of course, we couldn't ignore AI. We haven't tried to be, what's the future of AI in this report? That's a big question that probably a lot of people know more about than I do, certainly. But the data aspects of AI is something that we've focused on. And AI is there's lots of techniques, but basically it learns from data and uses that to draw conclusions. And so the data that goes into it is extremely important for what you get out. And so data has always been important for analysis across government, but this is going to amplify that, and thinking of how we gather and manage and govern data is going to be essential to it. I think there's a question of balancing risk and impact. We have to demonstrate you can do something useful with this, and that will help build government trust. You've got to think about the risks, not anything dangerously wrong, but we can't sit here and try and get everything perfect before we start, or the opportunities will have been missed. So it's that kind of thinking what your risks are, but making sure that you're doing something positive with it. And of course, there's a process of testing and learning. And just to conclude, so I think for a data person, there's that kind of key thing that data analysis is only as good as the data that you start with. And it's tempting to think that we're in some kind of race to adopt AI and ride that kind of tsunami of automation. But there's some things that happen quickly in the world and some things that happen slowly. And applying AI in government is going to be a really difficult mix of the two. The technology is changing very quickly, but the data that's going to power it changes much more slowly. Organization of government changes over time, but generally quite slowly. It can't happen overnight. And also the way that services are delivered, the things that people in the country want don't change that quickly. So it's that kind of tension between these two things is going to be quite hard to resolve. It always makes me nervous when I hear the phrase, for my data system, I want a single source of truth, because I see where that's coming from, but I think anyone who's worked with data knows that it's a kind of incomplete, imperfect, out-of-date, partial representation of real life. So your single source of truth is never the whole truth. And it's that kind of recognition of the limitations of the data that we have, and therefore the limitations of how you can analyze it, that I think we need to be taking into account. And that kind of leads to all these kind of things of making sure that we avoid digital exclusion, we avoid adverse effects of bias. And that kind of question I was saying earlier of the hard bits of data being the organizational aspect. So we need to be thinking about the entire system of how data and analysis and services and needs of citizens interact with each other. So we're making progress. There's still big challenges to overcome. We don't have all the answers, but we're hoping that an event like today can kind of gather opinions on that, exchange of ideas and experience, and help take this discussion forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill.